The diner sat on the edge of the forgotten highway, a sentinel of fading neon against the encroaching dusk. Its name, the Roadside Respite, felt like a cruel joke to Eleanor. No respite ever found its way here, not for her. The cracked vinyl of the counter stools mirrored the fissures in her own life, each chipped plate a fragment of a dream long shattered. Eleanor moved through the empty space like a ghost, her uniform, once crisp, now a tired drape over her thin frame. She was a woman carved from quiet endurance, her youth worn thin by the relentless friction of existence. Her hands, usually quick and efficient, trembled slightly as she wiped down the already spotless counter. Each swipe was a small, desperate prayer against the mounting tide of bills that threatened to drown her. The worn-out soles of her shoes had carried her through countless shifts, but they felt heavier tonight, weighted by the certainty that her rent was due, and the till was painfully, undeniably, empty. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, a low, mournful drone that echoed the despair in her heart. The diner was her entire world, a dusty, echoing cavern where she served coffee and hope in equal, scarce measure. She was alone, utterly and profoundly, with only the specter of debt for company. Her landlord, a man whose patience was as thin as Eleanor's wallet, had given her an ultimatum. No rent by Friday, no roof over her head. The words echoed in her mind, a relentless drumbeat of impending homelessness. A sharp, unexpected pain shot through her knee, a familiar agony that had become a constant companion since the accident. She'd tried to ignore it, to push past the ache, but tonight it felt particularly insistent, a physical manifestation of her crumbling resolve. The disability had cost her more than just her mobility. It had cost her the better-paying jobs, the opportunities that might have pulled her from this endless, grinding poverty. Now, every step was a testament to her quiet battle, a silent protest against a body that betrayed her as much as life itself. She leaned against the counter, her breath catching in her throat. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly yellow glow on her face, highlighting the dark circles beneath her eyes. A tear, hot and defiant, escaped and traced a lonely path down her cheek. She quickly brushed it away, ashamed of the weakness, but another followed, and then another, a silent cascade that betrayed the stoic facade she so carefully maintained. The diner, usually a refuge of routine, felt like a cage tonight, its walls closing in, suffocating her with the weight of her unspoken fears. It was in this moment of raw, unvarnished vulnerability that the bell above the door chimed, a sudden, jarring sound that sliced through the quiet desperation. Eleanor stiffened, quickly wiping her eyes, trying to compose herself. She turned, forcing a tired smile to her lips, ready to greet the rare customer with the practiced cheerfulness of a seasoned waitress. The man who entered was a stark contrast to the desolate surroundings. He was a biker, undeniably. Leather jacket, worn and scarred, bore the insignia of a club Eleanor didn't recognize. His face was a roadmap of life lived hard, etched with lines that spoke of countless miles and untold stories. A thick, dark beard framed a jaw that looked carved from granite, and his eyes, though shadowed beneath the brim of a cap, held a piercing intensity. He moved with a quiet power, a coiled tension that suggested immense strength. He walked directly to the counter, pulling out a stool with a scrape that grated on Eleanor's nerves. He didn't speak, didn't offer a greeting, simply settled onto the stool and gazed out the window at the deepening twilight. Eleanor felt a familiar prickle of apprehension. Bikers, in her experience, often brought trouble, or at the very least, a demanding, ungracious presence. But this man, he was different. His silence wasn't aggressive. It was contemplative, almost sorrowful. "What can I get for you?" Eleanor asked, her voice a little shaky despite her efforts. The biker turned his head slowly, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were a startling shade of blue, like chips of ice, but held an unexpected depth, a flicker of something ancient and weary. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering, as if he could see past her forced smile, past the tired uniform, into the very core of her exhaustion. Eleanor felt a strange mix of discomfort and a curious, unbidden sense of being seen. "Coffee," he rumbled, his voice a low gravel, like stones shifting in a riverbed. "Black." Eleanor nodded, turning to the ancient coffee machine. Her hands still trembled, but she moved with practiced ease, pouring the dark liquid into a chipped ceramic mug. As she placed it before him, the biker's eyes drifted to her hands, noting the slight tremor, the faint scars on her knuckles. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered, a silent acknowledgement of the struggle she tried so hard to hide. He took a slow sip of the coffee, his eyes still fixed on her. Eleanor, uncomfortable under his scrutiny, busied herself with rearranging sugar packets, her mind still replaying the landlord's harsh words, the increasing pain in her knee. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic on the highway. She wished he would leave, yet a part of her, the lonely part, found a strange comfort in his quiet presence. Then it happened. A single, choked sob escaped her, a sound she hadn't intended to make, a betrayal of her carefully constructed composure. She clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with mortification. The biker didn't flinch. He simply watched her, his blue eyes unreadable, yet oddly compassionate. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of tears welling, hot and stinging. The dam had broken. I'm so sorry," she whispered, turning away, her shoulders shaking. It's been a long night." The biker reached across the counter, his large, calloused hand gently placing a crumpled napkin beside her. He didn't speak, didn't offer platitudes. He just sat there, a silent, imposing presence, and allowed her to break. Eleanor, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness, found herself leaning against the counter, letting the tears fall freely, the dam fully breached. The weight of her burdens for a brief, cathartic moment lifted just enough for her to breathe. She eventually regained control, wiping her eyes with the napkin. "Thank you," she managed, her voice hoarse. I really shouldn't be doing this." The biker finally spoke, his voice soft, almost a murmur. "Everyone breaks sometimes." His gaze swept over the empty diner, the worn-out interior, then returned to her. "Hard times, huh?" Eleanor nodded, a fresh wave of shame washing over her. "Yeah, hard times," she hesitated. Then, driven by some desperate need to confess, to share the weight, she found herself speaking. "My rent's due Friday. I don't have it. My knee is getting worse. I can't pick up extra shifts. I don't know what I'm going to do." The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered, a confession to a complete stranger. The biker listened, his expression unchanging, his gaze unwavering. He didn't offer advice, didn't interrupt. He simply absorbed her words, a silent witness to her suffering. When she finished, a heavy silence descended once more, broken only by the distant sounds of the night. Eleanor felt a pang of regret. What had she been thinking? Pouring out her heart to a complete stranger, a man who looked like he'd seen too much hardship to care about hers. Then, the biker did something unexpected. He pulled out his phone, a battered, old flip phone, and began to tap at its worn keys. Eleanor watched, confused. Was he calling the police? Her landlord? Her mind raced, imagining the worst. But his movements were deliberate, unhurried. He raised the phone to his ear, and after a moment, spoke a single word. "Ghost." He paused, listening intently. Then, he spoke again, his voice low, but with an underlying current of authority that Eleanor hadn't noticed before. "I'm at the roadside respite. Got a situation. Kindness debt needs settling." Big one inch. He paused again, then added, "Tell the boys. All of them. Tonight." He ended the call, snapped the phone shut, and placed it back in his pocket. He looked at Eleanor, his blue eyes holding a strange glint. "That'll be all from me, ma'am," he said, his voice back to its gravelly rumble. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, crisp $100 bill, placing on the counter. "Keep the change." Eleanor stared at the bill, then at him, her mind reeling. $100? For a cup of coffee? And what had he meant by kindness debt? And all of them. She tried to ask, but the words caught in her throat. The biker simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head, then slid off the stool. He walked towards the door, his leather jacket rustling softly. "Wait," Eleanor called out, finding her voice. What was that about?" The biker paused at the door, his hand on the cold metal. He turned, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "My grandma always said, when someone helps you, you help them back. No questions, no expectations. Just help." He paused, then added, his voice a little louder, carrying a note of profound certainty. "You fed me when I had nothing. Tonight, we feed you forever." With that, he was gone, the bell chiming his departure, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the silent diner, clutching $100 bill, her mind awash with confusion, a flicker of hope, and a deep, unsettling sense of unease. The night deepened around the diner, and the distant hum of the highway seemed to hold a new, expectant note. Eleanor's world returned to its desolate rhythm in the days that followed. The $100 had bought her a few more days of uneasy peace, enough to buy groceries, enough to keep the landlord at bay for a fleeting moment, but was a temporary reprieve, a fragile dam against the rising tide. The biker's words, "Tonight, we feed you forever," echoed her mind, a strange, enigmatic promise that felt too fantastical to be real. She tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as the ramblings of a weary traveler, but a tiny seed of wonder had been planted in her heart. The diner remained empty, the silence her constant companion. She wiped down counters, brewed coffee for phantom customers, and wrestled with the ever-present ache in her knee. The desperation began to creep back in, a cold, insidious dread that whispered doubts into her ear. Had she imagined it? Had the exhaustion simply conjured a fleeting moment of hope out of thin air? The memory of the biker, with his piercing blue eyes and quiet authority, began to feel like a dream, a surreal interlude in the harsh reality of her life. Meanwhile, the story of Eleanor's kindness, like a spark carried on the wind, began to ignite a fire far beyond the desolate highway. The biker, known only as Ghost to his brotherhood, had made his call, and the message had rippled through their vast, interconnected network. From dusty desert roads to bustling city streets, from remote mountain passes to anonymous truck stops, the word spread. Ghost, a man of few words but immense respect within the biker community, had recounted his encounter with a quiet intensity that left no room for doubt. He spoke of the biting cold, the empty tank, the gnawing hunger. He spoke of his own desperation, a rare vulnerability for a man like him. And then he spoke of Eleanor. He described her weary eyes, the tremor in her hands, the quiet dignity with which she moved through her struggling diner. He spoke of the single, hot cup of coffee, the last few dollars she'd offered from her own meager earnings, the genuine concern in her voice when she'd seen his plight. He didn't embellish, didn't exaggerate. He simply laid bare the truth of her selfless act, an act of pure, unbidden compassion in a world often devoid of it. She had nothing, Ghost had told his lieutenants, his voice a low growl that commanded absolute attention. Less than nothing, and she gave me everything she had, without asking, without expecting, just gave. The story resonated deeply within the Brotherhood, striking a chord that vibrated with their own unspoken code. They were men often judged by their appearance, ostracized by society, but bound by an unwavering loyalty and a fierce, almost ancient sense of honor. A kindness debt, to them, was not merely a transaction. It was a sacred trust, a bond forged in the crucible of shared humanity. The message was clear. A good soul, an unseen angel, was in need, and the Brotherhood, an army of rough angels, would answer. Chapters from across the region began to mobilize. Calls were made, routes were planned, resources pooled. Mechanics, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, men with hands hardened by labor and hearts loyal to their own code, began to gather their tools, their machines, their collective will. The anticipation built a silent, powerful current flowing through the biker network. They were coming not for trouble, not for conquest, but for something far more profound. They were coming to repay a debt, to honor a kindness, to remind a forgotten soul that she was not alone, and that true generosity, once given, always finds its way home. Eleanor, oblivious to the gathering storm of gratitude, continued her lonely vigil in the diner. The old clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a painful reminder of her dwindling time. The ache in her knee pulsed with a dull, insistent rhythm, mirroring the anxiety in her chest. The memory of the biker, ghost, and a strange promise had begun to fade, swallowed by the overwhelming reality of her immediate problems. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The diner was, as usual, empty. Eleanor was wiping down tables, her movements slow and heavy when she first heard it. A faint rumble, a distant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath her feet. She paused, her hand frozen mid-wipe, and listened. The sound grew, slowly at first, a low thrum that she initially dismissed as a passing truck. But it didn't pass. Instead, it intensified, growing into a deeper, more resonant growl. The windows of the diner began to vibrate, a subtle tremor that made the few remaining coffee mugs rattle on their hooks. Eleanor's heart began to pound, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. The low growl transformed into a roar, a powerful, guttural sound that filled the air, shaking the very foundations of the old diner. It was the sound of 1,000 angry bees, magnified 1,000-fold, the sound of a storm front rolling in, not of wind and rain, but of steel and fury. The air crackled with its raw energy, a palpable force that pressed in on her. Eleanor stumbled back, dropping her rag. Her eyes darted to the window, wide with a sudden, icy fear. She saw nothing but the desolate highway stretching into the distance. But the sound was overwhelming now, a physical assault on her senses. It was coming from everywhere, vibrating through the floor, through the walls, through her very bones. Then she saw them. A dark mass appeared on the horizon, a distant smudge that rapidly grew, expanding into a formidable, terrifying entity. It was a river of steel, a tide of chrome and leather, flowing inexorably towards her. Hundreds, no, thousands of motorcycles, riding in perfect formation, their headlights piercing the twilight like the eyes of some colossal, mythical beast. The roar of their engines was deafening, a monstrous symphony that swallowed all other sounds, all other thoughts. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her mind screamed, no, it couldn't be. This was a nightmare, a terrifying hallucination born of her exhaustion and fear. But the sight was too real, too overwhelming. The bikers were a disciplined army, a dark, unstoppable force bearing down on her little diner. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed the edge of a table, struggling to stay upright, her body trembling uncontrollably. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped her. This was it. This was the consequence. She had made a terrible mistake. Her kindness, her small, desperate act of compassion, had somehow brought this terrifying retribution upon her. Had the biker been a scout? Had she somehow offended them? Her mind raced, conjuring images of violence, of destruction, of everything she held dear being shattered. She scrambled towards the back door, her bad knee screaming in protest, but her terror fueled her forward. She had to get out, had to hide. But as she reached the door, she hesitated, glancing back at the front window. The entire highway was now choked with bikes, a solid, unbroken line of gleaming machines stretching as far as the eye could see. There was no escape. Outside, the few scattered houses that dotted the desolate landscape had gone dark. Curtains twitched, doors slammed shut, and locks clicked into place. The distant sound of sirens, faint and uncertain, spoke of a community paralyzed by fear, turning inward, leaving Eleanor utterly alone, a solitary figure trapped in the path of the encroaching storm. She was a lamb before a wolf pack, a forgotten soul facing an overwhelming, incomprehensible force. The diner, once her sanctuary, had become her trap. The monstrous procession slowed, the roar of the engines deepening into a powerful, rhythmic throb. Eleanor watched, paralyzed, as the lead bikes, an intimidating phalanx of machines, peeled off the highway and began to roll towards the diner. Their chrome gleamed ominously in the fading light. Their riders, cloaked in leather and shadows, looked like figures from a dark legend. Her breath hitched, a choked gasp caught in her throat. This was the end. The lead biker, a figure Eleanor instantly recognized despite the helmet that obscured his face, brought his machine to a halt directly in front of the diner's entrance. It was Ghost. He killed his engine, and in that instant, a profound, almost deafening silence descended. The roar of hundreds of other engines, still running, seemed to amplify the sudden quiet, creating a surreal, unsettling soundscape. Then, in a single, breathtaking motion, as if commanded by an invisible conductor, every single biker, hundreds upon hundreds of them, cut their engines. The immense, earth-shaking roar vanished, replaced by an eerie, profound silence. The only sound now was the distant, nervous chirping of crickets and the frantic pounding of Eleanor's own heart. Ghost slowly dismounted, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He walked towards the diner door, his helmet still on, his face obscured. Eleanor stood frozen behind the counter, her hands clasped tightly, her knuckles white. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her terror was absolute, a cold knot in her stomach that threatened to consume her. He reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. He stood just inside the threshold, a towering, imposing figure. Eleanor braced herself, her eyes wide with fear, expecting a harsh word, a menacing gesture. Instead, Ghost slowly, reverently removed his helmet. His blue eyes, clear and steady, met hers. They held no malice, no anger, only a deep, abiding respect. His gaze swept over the empty diner, then returned to Eleanor, who stood trembling, a fragile figure caught in the overwhelming moment. Then he spoke, his voice a low rumble, but clear and resonant in the sudden, profound silence of the diner. "Ma'am," he began, "you probably don't remember me. I was here a few nights ago, stranded, cold, hungry." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "You gave me what little you had. You gave me warmth. You gave me food. You gave me hope." Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words, to reconcile this imposing figure with the gentle man who had silently offered her a napkin. Ghost turned slightly, gesturing with a sweeping motion towards the vast army of bikers visible through the diner's windows. "My grandma always told me, when you can help, you help. That's it. She also taught me that a debt of kindness is the most sacred debt of all." He looked back at Eleanor, his eyes intense. "You fed me when I had nothing. You showed me kindness when I deserved nothing. That debt, ma'am, is now our debt." He took a step closer, his voice growing stronger, imbued with the collective will of the brotherhood outside. "We are the sons of the road. We do not forget a kindness. We do not forget a good soul. And we always pay our debts." Then the unimaginable happened. Ghost turned back to the door, his eyes sweeping across the hundreds of bikers waiting in silent formation. He raised his hand, and in a single, synchronized movement that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine, every single biker removed their helmet. Their faces, scarred and weathered, hardened by life, were revealed. And then, in a gesture of profound respect, they all bowed their heads in unison. Eleanor gasped, a choked sound of disbelief and awe. Her terror, a moment ago so absolute, melted away, replaced by an overwhelming wave of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The sight of those men, those intimidating figures, bowing their heads in honor of her, a forgotten waitress in a forgotten diner, was a moment of pure, unadulterated catharsis. Tears, this time of profound relief and gratitude, streamed down her face. The perceived threat had transformed into an army of angels. Ghost turned back to her, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle, "tonight, we feed you forever." The profound silence that had settled upon the diner was suddenly broken by a flurry of organized activity. At a signal from Ghost, the hundreds of bikers outside sprang into action, moving with a disciplined efficiency that belied their rough appearance. It was not chaos, but a meticulously choreographed dance of generosity. A team of men, their faces grim but determined, immediately began to swarm the exterior of the diner. They carried toolboxes, ladders, and rolls of gleaming new roofing material. Within minutes, the cracked, leaky roof, a source of constant worry for Eleanor, was being systematically dismantled, replaced by sturdy, weather-tight shingles. Other bikers descended upon the diner's tired facade, scraping away peeling paint, patching cracks, and preparing the surfaces for a fresh, vibrant coat. Inside, another group of bikers, surprisingly gentle for their imposing size, began to carefully move furniture. They were meticulous, respectful of Eleanor's few belongings. They pulled up the worn, stained linoleum, revealing the decaying floorboards beneath. Carpenters, their hands calloused from years of labor, swiftly began to lay down new, gleaming hardwood, transforming the drab space with astonishing speed. Eleanor watched, utterly speechless, tears streaming down her face. It was a whirlwind of purposeful activity, a symphony of hammers and drills, of whispered instructions and shared tasks. Her little diner, a monument to her quiet despair, was being reborn before her very eyes. Ghost stood beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the midst of the controlled frenzy. "We heard about your knee, ma'am," he rumbled, his voice softening. "Got a couple of our best docs here. They're going to take a look. Make sure you get what you need." Before Eleanor could even process this, two men in clean, patched leather vests, their faces surprisingly gentle, approached her. One carried a medical bag. They introduced themselves as Doc and Sawbones, and their eyes, though weary, held genuine concern. They led her to a quiet booth, gently examined her knee, and spoke in soothing, reassuring tones, promising to arrange for specialists, for physical therapy, for everything she needed to regain her mobility. And then came the financial miracle. Another biker, a lean man with shrewd eyes, approached Ghost. He carried a thick folder and a small, leather-bound ledger. "Boss," he said, handing the folder to Ghost, "we got the landlord situation handled. All back payments cleared, 3 months prepaid. And the mortgage is paid in full. The diner is officially hers, free and clear." Ghost simply nodded, then turned to Eleanor, his blue eyes holding a profound satisfaction. "No more rent, ma'am. No more debt. This place is yours. For good." Eleanor felt her legs give out. She sank onto a newly installed stool, her head spinning. No more debt? Her diner. Hers? It was too much, too overwhelming to comprehend. This was not just a repayment. It was a complete, seismic shift in her entire existence. The community, initially paralyzed by fear, slowly began to emerge from their homes. Drawn by the incessant, purposeful sounds of work, they cautiously peered out. What they saw shattered their prejudices. Not an invasion, but a construction crew. Not a menace, but an army of benevolent builders. The initial terror gave way to confusion, then to disbelief, and finally to awe. Neighbors who had previously only offered pity or averted their gaze now stood openly, watching in stunned silence as the bikers worked. The once feared figures with their tattoos and leather were meticulously repairing, rebuilding, restoring. The sight of their selfless labor, their unwavering dedication to a stranger, forced the community to confront their own preconceived notions, to dismantle the walls of judgment they had so carefully constructed. Eleanor, the forgotten waitress, was being honored, revered, by a force they had all feared. As the day turned into night, the work continued under the glow of portable lights. The diner was completely transformed. New windows sparkled, fresh paint gleamed, and the kitchen, once grimy and inefficient, was now outfitted with brand-new, stainless steel appliances. The old, rickety counter was replaced by a solid, polished wood surface, and the cracked vinyl stools made way for comfortable, upholstered chairs. The bikers worked tirelessly, their movements coordinated, their purpose clear. They were a testament to the power of collective will, a living, breathing force of gratitude. And at the heart of it all, Eleanor sat, no longer trembling with fear, but weeping tears of profound, overwhelming joy, a silent witness to the most extraordinary act of kindness she had ever known. As dawn began to paint the sky in soft hues of rose and gold, the work was finally complete. The roadside respite, once a symbol of Eleanor's struggle, now stood gleaming and vibrant, a beacon of hope on the forgotten highway. The transformation was absolute, breathtaking. The bikers, tired but satisfied, began to gather their tools, their work done. They moved with the same disciplined efficiency that had marked their arrival. But now there was a quiet reverence in their movements. They had come, they had given, and now they would leave. Ghost approached Eleanor, who stood on the newly polished floor, gazing around her transformed diner with a look of stunned wonder. "It's done, ma'am," he said, his voice soft. "It's all yours." Eleanor turned to him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ghost simply nodded. "No thanks needed, ma'am. Just remember the code. Kindness given, kindness repaid." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather patch, the same insignia that adorned his jacket. He pressed it into her hand, a small token, "So you don't forget us. And so you know, you're always family." He turned, walked to his bike, and mounted it. In a synchronized movement, the hundreds of bikers who had been waiting patiently started their engines. The roar was not aggressive now, but a powerful, resonant hum, a collective sigh of accomplishment. As Ghost led the procession onto the highway, each biker, as they passed the diner, offered a respectful salute to Eleanor, a final acknowledgement of the bond forged in a moment of desperate kindness. The river of steel flowed away, disappearing into the rising sun, leaving behind only the shimmering heat on the asphalt and the profound silence of a new beginning. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her new diner, the leather patch clutched in her hand, watching until the last bike vanished from sight. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the gleaming surfaces, the fresh paint, the vibrant life that now pulsed within her walls. Her knee, miraculously, felt better, the pain a dull echo of its former intensity. The doctors had given her hope, a path to recovery she hadn't dared to dream of. The roadside respite was no longer a place of quiet despair. It was a testament to the unexpected power of compassion, a monument to the unseen good that exists in the world. Eleanor, no longer burdened by debt or loneliness, began to live her new reality. She hired help, trained new waitresses, and ensured that no one who walked through her doors hungry or cold would ever be turned away. Her kindness, once a solitary act, now rippled outwards, touching countless lives. The leather patch remained, a tangible reminder of the rough angels who had changed her life. It hung proudly behind the counter, a silent story for those who cared to ask. And sometimes a lone biker would stop, order a coffee, and smile faintly at the patch, a nod of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the enduring code. So what does it truly mean to be kind? Is it merely a small gesture, easily forgotten? Or is it a seed, planted in barren ground, that can blossom into an unexpected, life-altering forest of gratitude? Remember, the smallest acts of compassion, given without expectation, can echo far beyond our wildest imaginings. They can travel through networks unseen, touch hearts unknown, and return to us, transformed in a thunderous roar of thanks.